Welcome back to the channel. This is Punched. Continuing coverage of various facets of the game of Armored Knights Case Blue, Don Bend by Grognard Simulations. In this video, we're going to cover the supply rules and see if we can shed some light on that particular part of the game. So as you can see, I just got back from Consim World Expo 2025. I was a participant in a playtest for Armored Knights Case Blue Stalingrad. And we had the game developers Chris Fasulo and Robert Wiebe in attendance, as well as some other stalwart veterans of the Consim World Expo series of conventions. So shout out to Chris and Mike and John and Bill, as well as other people who were in the room, and also a shout out to other folks who came by during the convention, conference, whatever you might call it. Really had a lot of fun putting some faces to some of the names with your comments online. Really appreciate it, and a great experience. If you haven't had the opportunity to go to Consim World Expo, it is held yearly in Tempe, Arizona. It is a week-long monster gaming conference, and you get the opportunity to participate in multiple games should you care to do so. They have a lecture series in the evenings, and just a really good environment, really fun and collegial, and it's all pretty much all about monster games. Now it's not just about monster games. There were plenty of one map games out there, and all different time periods, and so on. There were a couple of card-driven games. There were some sports games. A lot of emphasis, I think, this year on World War II as a time period, and that was just fine. A lot of different systems, game systems on display. Excellent flea market. Of course, with the Trump tariffs this year, and that had, I think, a lot of knock-on effects for publishers who are heavily dependent upon foreign firms for printing game components. And so the dealer's room was not the best, but a shout out to Revolution Games, I believe they were there, and also a gentleman, Ramensandwich.com. He was vending t-shirts and tote bags that had very clever things on them. So anyway, that's pretty much it. The venue was awesome, and can't say enough good things about it. The entire experience was, aside from the heat, it was unambiguously and positive. You know, no negative experiences during the entire event. Really quite enjoyed it. Okay, so enough about Consim World. Okay, we're going to talk about supply. I think that there's a lot to learn about it. I will call out the examples of play number 4, which covers supply distribution and has a reasonably concise explanation, as well as a picture with diagrams and such. So this worked out really rather well. So I'm following on with that, and we'll go into a bit more depth, I think, than that, and hopefully make some things clear that haven't been clear before. So my agenda is this introduction, followed by setting up your supply charts, supply tables, if you will. We're going to talk about how to use the order of battle and the scenario card to prep everything, to get everything ready to play, and then to continue play. We're also going to talk about the transfer mechanics. So we're going to talk about receiving your supply points at the railhead by 6th Army, and then the transfer down from 6th Army to the various corps, and then transfers from corps to divisions and artillery brigades. We'll also spend a little bit of time and we will talk about the combat supply summary table and some of the implications thereof. We'll talk about combat supply and various things that, various consequences. Some are observations, some are just, I would hope, maybe a clarification of pointing out an obscure bit of rule, and some, I think, will be opinions. So, and we'll conclude this. So that's the start of this, and we'll get going in the next segment. Okay, let's talk about setting up the supply chart. So the first thing to know about that is that every organization, Army, Corps, Division, or Artillery Brigade, comes with a separate supply chit. These do not actually go on the map, right? They actually go on the supply chart. So the elements here on these supply chits are, first, you have you have the identifying information, which is 71st Infantry Division, the divisional symbol for it. You also see the color coding. The stripes are exactly the same as the ones on the counters that go on the map for the formation, so it makes it somewhat easier to pick out among the crowd. The number on the left, upper left, is the number of supply points that this formation earns, the 6th Army. The value here on the right, upper right rather, the 4, is the number of supply points required to put this the formation into combat supply. So let's place it on, I use the org chart for this. It makes things relatively simple to do. So here we see an example of this. We have the Corps supply chit for the 51st Corps, the associated 144th Artillery Brigade, 44th, 297, and 71st Infantry Divisions. And so it's just a simple matter then of moving them over here onto the supply chart into the appropriate places. Simple enough. So this gives you a hierarchical sort of top-down list of things, if you will, or progression. Okay, so that's the order of battle chart. Now let's progress on to the scenario chart. Okay, we're going to talk about the use of the scenario card in setting up your supply chart or table, as it were. So the first thing to know, we're looking at a copy of the Paulus Attacks setup map on the scenario card. And the first thing to notice is that these are the setups for 3rd Motorized, 100th Jaeger, and 60th Motorized. So we see on the map, we see the extent of the area in which you can set up units on the map. As far as supply is concerned, I'll call attention to 2 things for each unit. Let's see, the first thing is the numbers in red, or the letters in red. These denote supply points. So 3rd Motorized has 4 supply points. That's useful. You will actually put the supply points here on the chart. So we've already done that for the units visible here. And you get that information from the scenario card. Additionally, the circle with the yellow and black in it, that indicates that this unit starts the game in combat supply. I'll also call attention to the fact that higher level units, higher level organizations such as your Panzer Corps, your Infantry Corps, and so on, also have various values here. So by contrast, let's take a look at a different part of the map here. This is part of the Soviet setup, same scenario, and you'll notice that here we have a rifle division that is in combat supply, but we have another rifle division right here and a naval rifle brigade here that are not in combat supply at the start of the game. So, flipping over, we have the other side of the scenario card, and I've highlighted everything related to supply here in yellow. So first we just have the supply section here. This map is a supply trace map going from the railhead to 6th Army Supply Battalion. These two 6T locations are the supply extenders. And then you can see the various corps that make up 6th Army in this particular scenario. 8th and 51st Infantry, 14th and 24th Panzer Corps. All right, you can see the Soviet information here on the other side. In this case, the Soviet railhead is off map. Now, these are relatively straightforward. There is a little bit of complexity due to the changing situation, so I'm going to talk about that for a minute or two. So all of the Corps draw supply from 6th Army. 6th Army has supply extenders here and here. So, and it talks about this sort of thing. This is the western edge of the in-play map, and it talks about how on the first 2 days of the game, the trace range is 15 hexes. So that's not as straightforward as it could be. What it does mean, though, is that from the western edge of the map, you can come 15 hexes forward, and that's as far forward as your 6th Army can trace its supply. So 15 hexes into the in-play map, that is as far forward as you can have your supply battalion for each corps and remain, maintain supply trace. Now, of course, the corps themselves, the supply battalions, I believe come another 15 hexes forward of that. That's where your divisions and artillery brigades can be in terms of the maximum eastward extent. And then they typically can come either 3 or I believe 6 hexes further forward. Now, your corps supply battalions each have 2 extenders that will give you another 15 hexes each at a cost in a tax on the supplies. Note that they talk about how the trace range to the Corps supply battalions increases to 30 hexes on July 25th. That's because the Germans are improving the rail network, right? The Soviets have a different gauge track than the Germans. So as time moves on, the Germans are working diligently to re-gauge the track forward. And in this particular case, the historical outcome is that it moves forward about 37 or so kilometers over the course of these 2 days. So instead of having 15 hexes from the edge of the western map, now you get 30 hexes. Okay, so that's fairly useful. Okay, it talks about German rail burden. German rail burden is 6%. That is the amount of supply that you lose due to consumption, wastage, partisans, congestion on the line, and so on. They're talking about Army to Corps supply point transfer cost is 30%. So that represents 10%, 10%, and 10%, each of these hops. Ideally, you would like to not have the supply extenders at all and just have a 10% loss. That's the minimum that you can get going from Army to Corps. But unfortunately, because of the rapidity of the German advance prior to this scenario, you have to have the extenders in place. And if we have a rapid advance during this scenario, it may very well be that one or more corps may have to have their supply extenders in place. So this represents, well, basically it represents outrunning your supply lines. All right, corps to line formation supply point transfer cost is 10%. This is the base. All right, there is a German supply snafu. I'm going to read this verbatim. Due to a staff error which misassigned logistical support to 6th Army, neither German Panzer Division earns supply points for its top echelon, TE is top echelon, for its top echelon supply battalion during this entire scenario. That's significant. That is 12 supply points at the railhead that do not show up. They talk about the Soviets, and they say stored supply. There it is, where it is. Let's see. German and Soviet stored supply is indicated on the setup map. I already spoke about that. All artillery brigades start with 3 supply points stored. That's enough for 1 day of combat operation. At start, combat supplies marked on the map. Fine, fine. And reinforcements are always in full combat supply the day they enter play. So that's it for the scenario card, and we will continue onwards. Okay, in this segment we're going to talk about transferring supply points down the network. We'll start off with receiving supply points at the railhead, and then transferring from Army to Corps, and then from Corps to Division. So first off, the way that supply works is that 6th Army is going to receive at the beginning of the, within the start of day interphase, they're going to receive their supply points. The way that you determine how many supply points the Army receives is you total up all of these left-hand numbers on each of the supply chits, okay, on each of the formations. So 2, 3 for each of the infantry divisions, 2 for artillery brigades, 6 for each of the motorized or panzer divisions, and so on. Now, the grand total of that is 52. I'm not showing the other supply chart with the other 2 corps for this particular example, but they are part of the count. So 52. Now, I mentioned that there is a supply snafu and neither of the panzer divisions are receiving supply. So that takes out 12 points, and that leaves us with a total of 40. If you may recall, there is a 6% rail tax. The math on that from 40 is 2.4. I believe that is correct. Let's rerun the calculation here. 40 times 0.06 equals 2.4. This further rounds up. So supply points are denominated in whole supply point values. Now, ironically, there is actually a use for half supply points, and that is during a heavy barrage, each artillery battalion allocated to that heavy barrage under the auspices of an artillery brigade costs half a supply point. So it's possible, for example, to do a heavy barrage with 3 artillery battalions and use 1.5 supply points. So you have to account for that. But the only place that accounting happens, I believe, is at the artillery brigade level. So we're going to ignore that at this point in time. And supply transfers don't happen in half points, as far as I know. I think if you wanted to track them, you could, and that would be, I think it would be perfectly fine. It's just the rules don't actually talk about transferring half points. I think you could, though. So we're going to do some rounding here, and we're going to take that 2.4. If you were going half points, you could go to 2.5, but I think we'll go full points, and we'll round that up to 3. And that's the appropriate thing to do. So our 40 points become 37 points at the railhead due to the rail tax. So 37. Hey, it just so happens I have 37 points. So let's get that on the on the chart here. 3 10s, a 5, and a couple of 1s. So 37. So the rule for supply transfers is supply points can only transfer 1 echelon per day. So you can go Army to Corps, you can go Corps to Division or Brigade. Only once a day, though. So these supply points could go to any of the corps today. They cannot further go to the divisions. I will call attention to the example of play number 4, supply distribution on pages 8, and also the example on 9 with supply flows throughout the system. That is a pretty good example. And it talks about doing things sort of a bottoms up, so that you do everything you're going to do with your divisions first, and then you do your Army to Corps transfers and such. We're going to go top down for this example. Hopefully it will make a certain amount of sense. So in this example, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to transfer 30 points down to the Panzer Corps, 14th Panzer Corps here. So I'm going to transfer 30 points. I can transfer them out of what I've received and what I've stockpiled, okay? So I'm going to take 30 and just move them right on down. That gets placed in the received. Now, there is a 30% tax in place to do Army to Corps transfers because the two truck extenders are in place. So that's 30%. You have to pay from that. You have to pay the tax, so to speak, immediately. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. That is 9 points. So 30% of 30 is 9 points. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to move 5. So to point out, we have 12 points here, right? All total. So we have 5. And let's see, I will take a 3 and a 1. And that leaves me, that's 9 points there. That leaves me with 3 left over that go into stockpile. And so we are still at 12 points. We've done our spending. We've done our transfer. We've done everything that we can do. That's the Army to Corps transfer. So now let's talk about the Corps to Division transfer. So 24th Corps, right? That's where we have motorized and a Panzer division, and they are rather they take a lot of supply to use effectively, to put into combat supply. So I can see this is the setup, the initial setup that we have for the Paulus attack scenario, and I can see that each of the motorized divisions only have 4 supply points. They're going to need some resupply in order to get into combat supply. All right, so I'm going to transfer down 6 points. I'm going to make some change to do this. 6 points. Oh, first off, we're starting off with 27 points. Now, I cannot use these points, right? These points have already moved once. So the points here in this received bin, I can't use. This is where you really want to be thinking more of a bottom-up approach. That instead of pushing down to the divisions, almost think as pulling to the divisions, not pushing from the Corps, because that makes it easier to avoid a double move through the supply network of points. So I only have 27 to work with. So I'm going to move, let's just say that I'll move 6 to each of the motorized divisions and 8 to the Panzer division. So let me go ahead and do this. I'm going to make some change in order to do this. So I'm going to do 5 and 5. And let's see, another 5. Then I will do 3 and 1. That should be a 1. And that should be a 1. Okay, so that's a grand total of 20 supply points that I'm moving down. Now, you have to pay tax on that, right? So currently, in the current situation, the Corps to line or Corps to division transfer cost, tax, if you will, is 10%. I moved 20, so that's 2 points. So I'm going to take 2 points over here. Okay? And just to make the math, this whole thing, stockpile, spent, and what I transferred down should equal that starting 27 points. So we have 5. 20 here, 25, 27. The math is good. So let's see. Now we can include this in our stockpile for use in the next start of day interphase. But you want to do that after you've done everything. And we haven't quite finished off putting these units into combat supply. Now, in the turn that a division or artillery brigade receives supply points, they can actually spend them. That's because having received them, we're not transferring it further down the network, the supply network. So we've done our one hop to get these points, but they can immediately go into stockpile and be spent, if you will. So that's exactly what I'm going to do here. I'm going to spend 8, and 8 and 8. There we go. And I'm going to get into combat supply, right? Further, I want artillery, so I'm going to spend the available 3 supply points and put the artillery brigade into combat supply. We'll talk about these supply chits in a moment. So that's it, basically. That's movement of the supplies through there. We'll do some further analysis and talk about supply chits in a moment. Okay, in this segment, we're going to talk about combat supply, and we're going to talk about some of the consequences of how the system is produced. So, just as earlier we spoke of, I spoke of, rather less pedantic, I suppose, the combat chits, there are also combat supply, combat supply chits. So these combat the supply chits go on the supply chart. The combat supply chips go on the map. They are meant to indicate which formations have, or in some cases, don't have supply. Notice that the color coding is the same. They will match up with your formation units on the map, making it at least somewhat easier to tell who's got what. So I have the combat supply chits here just for illustrative purposes. Now, this other combat supply chit, none of the artillery brigades, you'll notice that they don't have their own separate unit or formation color coding. They just have the color coding of their parent corps, right? So white for 14th Corps, yellow for 8th Corps, and so on. Blue is for the Army. Instead, they use a generic supply chit. Curiously enough, the reverse side of these generic supply chits, combat supply chits rather, have the word shat on them. No, it does not mean the word shat. It is short for shattered. So just be aware of that. There is a rule that says if you take 75% casualties, then your formation is considered shattered, and there are some consequences with that. So you don't want your formations to get shat upon, perhaps. All right. So that is the use of combat supply. Now let's talk about some consequences here. So at the start here, we had, I believe we had 5 supply points at the Army stockpile. We had 27, we had 27 in 14th Panzer Corps. We had 4 each in the motorized divisions and 8 in the Panzer Division. So if you take a look at this, we've got some degradation. We used more than 1 days. We received 37 at the railhead. We used 39, right? So we've dropped our overall supply at 6th Army level. We've increased it at 14th Panzer. We've gone up a bit from 27 to 35. That's not too bad, but we've dropped in each of the motorized divisions and just barely stayed even at 16th Panzer. So to go into combat supply next turn, we're going to need to transfer more of these points down to the divisions and so on. The problem that you wind up with is that 37 points that we started with at the railhead that we get each day, it only goes so far. And due to even if we had 0% tax, that 37 points is not really enough to run things. And so one of the consequences is that you wind up kind of having to go stop and start in terms of your combat supply. Very, very often, a fair amount of your entire army is going to be going without combat supplies. So the way things work generally is that you'll be in combat supply for 1 or more turns, and you'll have to stop and build supply back up. So, in fact, I will point out that the example that we had of transferring points down to 14th Panzer Corps, we didn't do anything for 8th Corps, 8th Infantry Corps. 8th Infantry Corps does have enough on hand to bring all of their units into combat supply for 1 day. That's not much. And there's enough to basically get the divisions back into combat supply for a second day, but I don't think it quite has enough for the artillery battalion, and you really do want, artillery brigade, you really do want those artillery brigades. They provide a lot of offensive punch. So that's, those are the trade-offs that you have. You never have enough supply coming in to keep everybody supplied all the time. Now, starting off, just about every unit has enough supply to go into combat supply, maybe with a little help from their respective corps. So everybody gets to go the first day, and there's enough supply in the system to maybe go a second day. And of course, you'll be doing the math on the on trying to figure out where best to send your daily supply points and move them down the network to where you're going to need them. So that's part of the operational challenge here in this game, is to handle the supply so that in such a way that your combat operations are most effective. So let's talk about this. What happens if you are not in combat supply, right? So let's take an example of an infantry division that is not in combat supply, and also a motorized division not in combat supply. So there are rules for it in the rule book, and I believe that the spiral-bound list of charts has a degraded units summary. But to sum up, for infantry units, they're not actually in too bad a shape. So for infantry units, they can still move. If you were leg infantry or horse-drawn, that is to say movement of 4 or 6, those indicate infantry and horse-drawn, horse-supported units. In those cases, you can still move all that you want to move. For that matter, defensively, you can still fight with no degradation. You lose half of your combat points, combat factors rather, in the offense when you don't have combat supply. And also, your entire formation can only make one attack, right? So you may have, 3 regiments typically in an infantry division, but you'll only be able to make one attack. Now, maybe you can use more than one regiment. You may be able to use all of your regiments and make an attack, but it is at half strength. Additionally, in the attack, you get no artillery from that formation. In the defense, you get artillery, but only at half strength. So a decent enough defense, but very anemic sort of offense. The motorized and panzer divisions suffer from the same issues in terms of half strength attack, half strength artillery, and only one attack for the entire division. They also suffer from a quartering of their movement allowance. So, for example, an armored company typically is going to have a movement allowance of 8. They will have a movement point allowance of 2. So it really hits your motorized and your mobile divisions hard. So that's it for consequences. I would say, this is my opinion, I would say that you're probably going to be looking at keeping your armor as much as possible in supply and let them do the bulk of the movement and attacking. You will be able to move up your infantry, but mostly I would think that if you can, you want your infantry to get moved into position where the enemy has to attack you, right? Or you need to leave them in a static defense. Either way, those should work out fairly well. You may recall, I recall hearing this a number of times, strategic offense, in this case operational offense, tactical defense. That phrase works pretty well with the limitations on the supply system. One other thing to consider is to slowly drip a point or two every turn to your infantry units, and you can build up over time. But do remember the tax. So if I were to send, let's say 1 point down to the 8th core, I'd still have to pay the tax on that, and the tax is denominated minimum 1 supply point, right? Even though suppose the tax is 30% right now, so I would have to pay 0.3 supply points, but in actuality it's 1 supply point. So the minimum that I might properly send, say, is more like 3, I think, and that would get me, I would have to spend 1, I believe, if that's visible. I would have to spend 1 to send 3, and that would be about right mathematically. So just something to be aware of. That tax is going to hurt you a lot. Okay, I think, did I have 8? I had 8. I had 9 rather that I spent. Okay, so the math is all good. Right, so that's consequences. So we'll do a little bit more. We'll talk about the combat supply table, and then we'll wrap up this video here shortly. Okay, let's talk about the combat supply summary table here. This is a very useful table when you're playing the supply system, and it summarizes the things to know about your different levels of headquarter and supply battalions. I'm mostly going to concentrate on the Axis parts here. I will have a note or two about the Soviets. So things to know here. Most of the time you're going to be playing with the top echelon headquarter supply points, top echelon headquarter supply points earned, right? Now, if you may recall, pardon me, those are the values here. Let's see, your 6 right here and your 8 right here off the supply chits. So this simply summarizes it, and it talks about some other types of units here, such as the Soviet mechanized corps or tank corps, and so on. But we're mostly paying attention to Germans in this talk. So so you have your infantry. So you have a summary of your supply points earned, a summary of your combat supply points required. Okay, the sustenance supply points is not in play unless your unit gets pocketed, right, surrounded. For example, the 6th Army being surrounded at Stalingrad. And normally, this is abstracted out. Part of the normal function of your normal supply lines is you do not have to pay these costs, right? And what is this? Food, water, perhaps basic medical supplies, and the like, okay? These do not include going into combat supply. Now, if you are pocketed, you have to pay these from the available supply points on hand, or there are negative consequences, mostly having to do with increasing your isolation level, making it more likely that your units will surrender. Okay, enough about sustenance supply. Most of the time in these games, you're not going to have to deal with this type of stuff, but it is a very frequent occurrence, and in fact does happen during Don Bend, where the Soviets get about 2 divisions, roughly 1 or 2 divisions encircled rather, at one point, and they will be on sustenance supply. The Germans, in fact, the starter scenario abstracts it out a bit, but the 14th Panzer Corps, the 16th Panzer Division, 3rd and 60th Motorized divisions do get themselves surrounded. They go too far out, too fast, and get away from their supporting infantry units and get themselves surrounded for a time. You won't actually have to use sustenance supply. The scenario, the tank cemetery scenario, which is the one that covers some of those operations when they are surrounded, actually has the separate supply rules that are specific to the scenario, so you don't have to track sustenance. All right. Things of note here would be that your units, so particularly your higher echelon units, and you'll notice that lower echelon units need not apply, but higher up in your supply network, each of your supply battalions has a transport capacity and a storage limit, and these are really important. So your 6th Army, for example, can transport 50 supply points. You may have 100 supply points, but you can't move them all in one start of day interphase. You have to wait till the next day. Additionally, if you ever get more points than this, more than 50 that you move down or spend in tax, plus 60 that you have in storage, you forfeit them. Right? So suppose, for example, another way to forfeit points is suppose that you received your 37 supply points one day and you decide not to move any of them down to the core. Of course, you will not do this, but if you did, they go away, right? So you always need to keep supply points moving through your network. Note that your core headquarters can have 25 supply points moving down and can store 30. This becomes a little bit more consequential at the core. At the Army level, you're always moving points down. You're more likely to have a considerably less than 60 in storage. With your core headquarters, particularly a core headquarter that has motorized or panzer divisions, 25 storage point or supply points, that's not really enough throughput. Okay, let me explain. So recall right here that it takes 8 points to put a motorized or panzer division into combat supply. 3 of those divisions, typical for a corps, and you're going to have 24 supply points. Well, with a 10% tax, for example, that would come out 24 points, supply points comes out to about a 3-point tax. Slightly less if you're doing fractional accounting, but the game doesn't really permit that. But there's nothing, I think, stopping you from doing fractional accounting on a piece of paper or something if you so really wanted to. But I think the designer's intent is to round up to full points. So rounding up to full points, that's 3. The tax is 3, and then 24. That's 27 supply points. You can't actually do that, right? The 25 points here includes the tax. Okay, so you get 25 max, which means realistically that you're probably sending what it would be 22 points, and then 3-point tax, that's 25. That's the most that you can send on an ongoing basis, which means that every so often you're going to come up short with at least one of your divisions. Even if you were getting full points every time from 6th Army, you'll come up short. Sooner or later, you have to give your motorized, you have to give your mobile units a break every so often, and that is effectively enforced by the limitations of the supply system. That's fairly realistic, as I understand it from the reading that I've done in Glance and other sources. The Germans wind up outrunning their supply, they're outrunning their logistics, and it's even their inherent logistics, right? Because it will be interesting to see, I think, later versions of the game in later, like 1943, perhaps 1944, if Armored Knights should happen to go that far. And it will be interesting to see whether the transport capacities remain the same, particularly as the Germans move further west, falling back on their normal logistics, their normal train system, double-tracked railroad tracks, for example, and also improved, hopefully improved logistics capabilities that you might actually see something where, given the supply points, I would hope that maybe, and again, the research has to be done on this, but maybe we get to the point in a future iteration of the game where the transport capacity is such that you can run an armored corps flat out all the time if you have the points coming in from the Army. I don't know. That's pure speculation, but it's important to know this stuff. Now, for infantry, you're in great shape. Infantry only requires 4. So if you are running 3 infantry divisions, that's only 12 supply points, plus the artillery is another 3 for 15. You can run your infantry flat out all the time with this transport capacity, given the supply points. Also, one thing to consider is if you get into situations or if the rules allow for you to move a division from one corps to another, you want to pay attention not to load up a corps with too many divisions, particularly these motorized and panzer divisions. So that's about it. Hope you enjoyed the video. A bit lengthy, but it's a bit of a lengthy topic. And if you like the video, hit the like button. I will have one parting thought. Okay, so a number of the scenarios actually script, right? Script the supply. Those tend to be the shorter scenarios that are in very specific situations. Could the supply be scripted here for the larger scenarios? Yes, I think they could. It would require additional research, which may have already been done on the part of the developer, to provide a daily, oh, well, you have this much, the following divisions can be in combat supply on every day. They would have to, of course, provide additional information on paper, have to print that up at additional expense, and so on. So you could basically run this in theory with the training wheels, right? Which is that you get no more supply than the Germans did historically. But I think that overall the supply system is a positive because it allows you to exercise, to fine-tune things at the operational level, and part of the reason why we do these games is to figure out, hey, could I have done it better than Paulus, right? Could I have done it better than the commander on the scene? And when you're playing an Eastern Front game, you really do need a logistical model to say, hey, could I have tweaked that model a little bit better? Can I run my panzers more than they got run historically? Can I run my infantry more than they got run historically? What's going to give me the best outcome? So I think that this is a not overly complex system, and I think that it's actually, it's not strictly necessary, but it's something that you would really want to have. If you're, it makes the game a little less game-like, but it makes it a better simulation and gives you more scope for doing those, making those operational decisions, and maybe finding out something that that wasn't historically done, but that makes a lot of sense. Anyway, okay, thanks very much for watching. Yep, that's it. I have talked myself out. So we'll see you down the road.